You can't almost be a Christian. It's like being sort of pregnant, it just doesn't, or partially surrendering in battle. I saw this post, and it was just a joke, but it was an advertisement that said, "Parachute for sale, used only once, never opened." I gotta say, if the parachute doesn't open, that's not a parachute. That's an ambitious backpack, There's an old classic movie called The Princess Bride. Do you guys remember The Princess Bride? Came out in the 80s, classic movie. And there's a moment where a character is supposed to be dead, but the medicine, played by the infamous Billy Crystal, he says, no, he's only mostly dead. Do you remember this? Right? Now, it's a funny bit for the movie, but of course we know that's ridiculous, right? There are some things you can't be almost, or kind of, or sort of, right? Like devotion to God. Devotion is one of those things that is not graded on a curve. Now, today we are continuing our chronological Bible study, or our study of the Bible. And if you're just joining us, we are reading through the entire Bible in a year, which is sort of crazy. We're almost halfway done. We're 2 weeks away from the halfway point. Now, when I mention this, I always like to give two little disclaimers. Number one, if you are just joining us for the first time, that's okay. You don't have to play catch up, right? You can just dive in where we are. The beauty of Scripture is that the more you study it, the more you get out of it, the better you can understand what you read. But even if you're jumping in for the very first time, you can still catch sight of the picture being made. So a person who has studied the Scriptures every single day for decades and a child who has just picked up the Bible for the very first time, they can sit right next to each other and both learn something about God. That's the beautiful thing about Scripture. Second, I want to point out that to read the Bible in a year means that we are reading really fast, right? We are just cruising through it. And our little moment together here on a Sunday morning, we can't get into all the detail that we might want. And so the preachers at Aldersgate, we work really hard to pull out the main themes for you, to help you understand the text. But we are skimming along the surface of some very deep waters. Now, if you would like to dive deeper, I always want to point out and make sure you know that we have chronological Bible studies throughout the week, and we meet at both campuses at different times throughout the week. And so if you want to go deeper, just reach out to the office and let us know, and we can hook you up with one of those groups. Now, before we dive in, I want to give you a little warning. We are coming out of a season of wisdom literature. The last couple of weeks, we've been talking about wisdom literature and Song of Songs and the King Solomon, Proverbs, and we've been reading a lot of poetry. And Proverbs are like these little quippy bits of advice that are really handy. Now, we are diving this week, we're getting back into the historical narrative. And after a couple of weeks in poetry land, the historical narrative kind of feels like drinking from a fire hose, right? There is so much stuff that happened this past week in the reading. But the core that I want you to find today in the text has to do with idolatry. You can't be sort of pregnant. You can't be mostly a Christian, and you definitely can't almost surrender to God. Let me show you what I mean. Okay, so 2 Kings 22, verse 41, it says, Jehoshaphat, son of Asa, began to rule over Judah in the 4th year of King Ahab's reign in Israel. Jehoshaphat was 35 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem for 25 years. His mother Azubah, the daughter of Shilhi. Jehoshaphat was a good king, following the example of his father Asa. He did what was pleasing in the Lord's sight. During his reign, however, he failed to remove all the pagan shrines, and the people still offered sacrifices and burned incense there. Jehoshaphat also made peace with the king of Israel. Okay, so I want to make sure everybody can kind of locate this story in the narrative, right? So everybody remembers Moses, right? We remember Moses, and he led the people out of slavery. Then they wandered in the desert for 40 years. Then we transferred everything over to a guy named Joshua. And Joshua led them into the promised land, and he was this big warrior, and he fought, and he led them into a period called Judges. Right? And you remember the rhythm of Judges, right? People would start out, they'd get in trouble, so then God would raise up a judge to save them. Everything was good for a little while. Then they get back into trouble. God would have to raise up another judge, and everything was good and it was just this cycle of what happened for the book of Judges. And it was a mess. It was really ugly. And so then we get to the monarchy, right? The monarchy. Israel wants a king. And so King Solomon goes first. King Saul. Saul goes first. He establishes the throne, and then there's a really messy handoff to King David because King Saul really wanted to hang on to power. We hand it off to David after Saul's death, and then David is this great warrior. So he conquers a bunch of the land and really establishes the boundaries of Israel. Then King Solomon takes over, his son, and that's what we've been recently is King Solomon, and he takes over, and it's just peace and prosperity, and it's amazing, and that's where we dive into all this wisdom literature. But after Solomon, Israel goes through a really rough period. They actually go through a civil war, and they split into two kingdoms. And it gets a little confusing because the northern kingdom is still called Israel, and the southern kingdom is called Judah. Right? And the southern kingdom, they're all sort of the tribes of Israel, but only the northern part is called Israel. Now, this is when prophets become really important. Do you remember we talked about prophets a little bit? When God gave Israel the monarchy, when he established the kings, he told them kings are a bad idea. You don't want to give that much power to a person. They're going to go corrupt. They're going to take advantage of people. And the people of Israel said, we don't care. Give us a monarchy. We want a king. And so God established a monarchy, but he also established the role of a prophet. Now, the prophet is the mouthpiece of God, and his job is to go to the king and smack him upside the head when he starts doing bad stuff. Right? That was the role of the prophet, was to be God's mouthpiece to the king who is trying to go corrupt. We saw it with David and Bathsheba, right? The prophet Nathan came in and he showed David his sin. And so then we fast forward to our scripture lesson, and we're dealing with the two really famous prophets of Elijah and Elisha. Now, these two guys, at this time, the kingdom is full of false idols and false gods, and the prophets, Elijah and Elisha, they have such a hard time keeping the kings on track. They've got their hands full running around trying to clean up the mess that the kings are making. I think a decent comparison when I read the story of Elisha and what he had to do with the kings, it's a little bit like the prophet is like running around behind a dog with a pooper scooper, right? Like he's just, I got to clean up the mess. You guys are making another mess over here. So let's hear it again. Verse 43. It says, Verse 43, Jehoshaphat was a good king, following the example of his father Asa. He did what was pleasing in the Lord's sight. During his reign, however, he failed to remove all the pagan shrines, and the people offered sacrifices and burned incense there. Now, Jehoshaphat also made peace with the king of Israel. So Jehoshaphat, which is not just a fun thing to say when you sneeze. You ever do that? Like, Jehoshaphat. He was a good king. And he was the king of Judah, the southern kingdom. And he did a good job, but he failed to remove the pagan shrines, and people kept worshiping at these false gods. So he was almost obedient to God. He did a good job, except for this one thing over here, right? Which is sort of like being faithful to your wife all of the days except for Thursdays. It just doesn't work like that. That doesn't make any sense. And so you can't sort of obey God. You can't kind of obey, when you talk about worshiping God. And here's what I want you to catch. There is a rhythm in Israel's history of a king who almost follows God. And that is the reason the country is on almost constant turmoil. Jehoshaphat comes first, but 10 chapters later, we got King Jehu doing the same thing. Each king would come in, and they would destroy some of the bad stuff. They'd be like, this is what's ruining our country, and they would destroy some bad stuff. But then they would keep other bad stuff. So Jehoshaphat got rid of the prostitutes, which were a big problem during his dad's reign. He said, those guys are a big problem, we're getting rid of them. But he left the pagan shrines. And then we fast forward to 2 Kings chapter 10, verse 26. And it says, 2 Kings chapter 10, verse 26. Let me see if I can find it here. And it says, and so Jehu comes in, and it says in verse 26, they dragged out the sacred pillar used in the worship of Baal, and they burned it. And they smashed the sacred pillar, and they wrecked the temple of Baal. They converted it into a public toilet, as it remains to this day. So that starts out pretty good. He takes the worshiping of the false god, and he turns it into a public toilet, which is insult and injury. But, verse 29, in this way, Jehu destroyed every trace of Baal worship in Israel. He did not, however, destroy the golden calves at Bethel and Dan, with which Jeroboam, son of Nebat, had caused Israel to sin. So he got rid of the Baal worship, yay, but he left the golden calves. It says that Jehu did not worship God with all of his heart, just some of it. And the kingdom of Israel suffered. And then it happens again with King Joash in 2 Chronicles 24. And I know I'm kind of jumping around, but I'm trying to show you a theme. 2 Chronicles chapter 24, verse 4, it says, at one point, Joash decided to repair and restore the temple of God. And then it jumped down to verse 13. It says, the men in charge of the renovation worked hard, and they made steady progress. They restored the temple of God according to its original design, and they strengthened it. And so Joash has this buddy who's a priest. I'm not totally sure how to say his name, Jehoiada, I think. And so he gets together with this guy. He does all this work to restore the temple with his buddy, the priest Jehoiada. But then when Jehoiada dies, verse 17, it says, but after Jehoiada's death, the leaders of Judah came and bowed down before King Joash, and they persuaded him to listen to their advice, and they decided to abandon the temple of the Lord, the God of their ancestors, and they worshiped Asherah poles and idols instead. Because of this sin, divine anger fell on Judah and Jerusalem. Now, that's just 3 examples, but you see it, right? You catch that rhythm that happens. The king, he wants to do what's right, so he gives part of his life to God. But he keeps something for himself. He keeps the pagan shrines, the golden calves, the Asherah poles, whatever it is. There is a place, a piece that the king tries to keep for himself. And what we learn from that is that there are no half measures in worshiping God. If you want to call yourself a Christian, you've got to be all in, 100% submitted to God and only God. But let's take a second and pull the story into the here and now, okay? How many of you, quick show of hands, how many of you have ever been tempted to worship a golden calf? Nobody? Huh. Well, how straight? How about an Asherah pole? Anybody ever been tempted to worship an Asherah pole? No? That's so weird. And you're probably thinking, well, of course not. We're not like those silly, primitive, dumb Israelites. We're not like those people. So let me ask you one more question. Does anybody know the going rate for a ticket to Taylor Swift's Eras tour? Don't worry, I looked it up because I was curious, right? It varies widely depending on the stadium. The cheapest ticket I saw was nosebleed seats in a massive stadium for about $130. But the average, according to Ticketsmarter.com, the average price, when you take all the tickets and you divide it out by the average price you will pay to see Taylor Swift perform this year is $4,691.72. Now, I am not saying that Taylor Swift is some sort of false god, right? If you love her music and you get a chance to see her perform, that's great. You go ahead, that's awesome. Actually, you know what? Let me walk that back a little bit. It's fun to poke fun at Taylor Swift because she's having this like big, flashy cultural moment. But let's, on a much smaller level, let me use a different example. How many of you are tempted to go out to dinner an extra time each week instead of giving money to like a homeless ministry? How many of you are tempted to get a designer coffee 3 or 4 times a week instead of giving 10% to the church? And I'm not trying to make you feel guilty. I don't want people to feel bad, but I don't want us to fool ourselves into thinking that we are better than those ancient Israelites. We are just as likely to slip into idol worship. We just have different idols. Actually, that leads me to the second thing I want you to grab from the text. We as human beings, we are designed for worship. In the heart of hearts, at the core of who we are created with a burning desire to worship something. And I'm not just talking about Christianity. People will walk away from their church, but their life is still aimed at worship. But because that's how we were designed, right? Maybe there are people who stop going to church, but then they get like really involved in politics, or they get really involved in social causes, right? They'll go to meetings, they gather with like-minded people, they'll get all pumped up by passionate speakers, they will donate their time, they will donate their money, they will go door to door handing out pamphlets, trying to convince other people to join their cause. Now you tell me, am I talking about the Democrat Party, the Republican Party, or Jehovah's Witnesses? It's all the same, right? Human beings can walk away from the church, but we can't run away from our desire to fill our lives with worship. For some families, they get all wrapped up and they start worshiping sports or their job or video games or social media presence. There was a guy, G.K. Chesterton, he was buddies with C.S. Lewis, and he once wrote, "When we cease to worship God, it's not that we worship nothing. It's that we will worship anything." Human beings are created for worship, and if we don't put God at the center of that urge, we will find something else, but it won't be as satisfying. Psalm 100 puts it like this. Psalm 100, it's a short little one. It says, "Shout with joy to the Lord for all the earth. Worship the Lord with gladness. Come before him singing with joy. Acknowledge that the Lord is God. He made us and we are his. We are his people, the sheep of his pasture. Enter his gates with thanksgiving. Give into his courts with praise. Give thanks to him and praise his name. For the Lord is good. His unfailing love continues forever, and his faithfulness continues to each generation." That's the whole chapter. But right there in the middle, it said, God made us and we are his. Worshiping God is the true source of purpose and true fulfillment for this silly little group of people called human beings. So the first thing we see in the text is that you can't almost surrender to God. And then the second thing we see is that we are designed to be creatures who worship. Now that brings us to the final piece. Jehoshaphat, Jehu, Joash, each one of them picked a different thing to try and worship, right? Golden calves, pagan shrines, Asherah poles. And for every single one of them, they were disappointed. Israel suffered, right? And so the important thing that we remember is that idols will always break your heart. If you try to center your purpose, your drive, your identity on something that is less than God, it will crumble. Idols will always break your heart. Tim Keller puts it like this. He said, "An idol is whatever you look at and you think in your heart of hearts, if I have that, if I could feel that my life will have meaning, I'll know that I have value, I know that I will feel significant and secure if I have that." And there are many ways to describe that kind of relationship to something, but perhaps the best one is worship. If there is something out there and you look at that and you think, if I just had that, then I would be satisfied. But here's the secret. Idols will always disappoint. Idols will always let you down. Idols will break your heart. And I think it's confusing for a lot of us because we have built idols out of things we can't attain, things we haven't gotten to. We fool ourselves. We say, oh man, if I just had that awesome job, or if I just had a little bit better vacations like my neighbor does, if I could just have that, if I could just have a better connection with my family, or if I just had a better spouse, or whatever it is, if I just had that, I would be satisfied. But here's the problem. We live in a culture where people have actually achieved that level. They have all the fame. They have more money than they could ever spend. They have the nicest cars, the most incredible homes. They go on the world's greatest vacations. And over and over and over, we see it is not enough. I think one of the greatest ways that we fool ourselves is we look at rich people who are sad and we think, well, they may not appreciate it, but if I had it, I would. Don't you think that sometimes when you see a rich person or a famous person who's sad, you're like, oh man, they're just doing it wrong. If I had it, I would be I would be satisfied. There is a hole in the heart of humanity, and nothing in the world can fill it. Idols will always break your heart. The good news that I have for you this morning is that nothing can withstand the weight of your worship except for God. Nothing can withstand the weight of all your hopes and your dreams, all your deepest desires, the core of your identity and the resonance of your soul, except for God. Only the love of God can truly satisfy you. He is the only one who can complete you because he is the one who made you. He made you and said, you are mine. You are for me and I am for you. There is this relationship that nothing else can fit. And so our response is to turn all our worship to God and God alone. Don't sort of be a Christian. Go all in. Commit 100% to your life. I think about those three kings, Jehoshaphat, Jehu, Joash, and how they all got rid of some of their idols, right? It's kind of like keys, right? All right, I'm going to give up the key to the Baal worship. I'm going to get rid of that, but I'm going to keep the pagan shrine key to myself, right? I will give up the prostitutes, but I'm going to keep the key to the golden calves, right? Or in our lives, I think it's helpful to think about it like days of the week. I'll give God Sunday morning. He can have the key to Sunday morning, but I'm going to keep Friday night, right? Maybe I'll give him Wednesday night, but Monday morning, on my way to work, I don't want to be a Christian. I don't want to act like a Christian when that guy cuts me off on my way to work and I'm tired and cranky. On Friday night, I want to live my life my way. I'll give Jesus like Tuesday afternoon for Bible study, but the key to my budget, I want to keep that one in my pocket. The key to my social life, the key to my job, the key to my family, my marriage. Give God the whole set of keys. Give God every part of your life. Dedicate your heart to the one thing that can actually handle it. Dedicate your life to the greatest purpose it could ever have, which is obeying Jesus. There is no substitute for God. There is nothing in your life that can satisfy you. And so my challenge for you is pretty obvious. I want you to give God the whole set of keys. Get rid of all the kind of sort of maybe almost language. Completely surrender to God with your life. I quoted Tim Keller earlier, and the reason I did that, first, he's an incredibly smart man. He just passed away a couple weeks ago. He was a brilliant scholar and a gifted pastor. But he wrote a book about this called Counterfeit Gods, and it's all about idolatry. And he tells this story that I wanted to share with you. When Tim was a young man, he met a woman who had had a very hard life. She was in her 40s, and she'd been in and out of jail. She'd been in and out of drug addiction. She looked a lot older than her age. Does that make sense? And so when she met with him, she told her story. And apparently in her life, she said, I have been cursed with the fact that I was born beautiful. She was a beautiful baby. She was a beautiful little girl. And apparently she was an absolutely beautiful young woman. And because of that, there were always men who were after her, especially powerful men who thought that having a beautiful woman like that was a symbol of their power. And because of that, she turned male affection into an idol in her life. She literally felt like she was nobody unless a man loved her. Didn't matter who it was, just she needed someone always. And as a result, she didn't put up decent boundaries in her life. She was not selective about who she was with, and that led to a lot of abuse, sometimes even violence. She was in and out of drug addiction. Like I said, she had a horrible life. And then it all broke down, and she hit rock bottom. And eventually she became a Christian. She became a Christian, and at the same time, she started therapy. And the therapist was really helpful. He was so kind, and he really walked her through a lot of stuff. But she told Pastor Tim, she said, my therapist told me that my problem is that I base my self-image, my significance, and my security on male affection. And so she looked at the therapist, and she said, right. And then the therapist said, well, this is terrible for you. You have no boundaries. This is leading to abuse, all that. She looked at the therapist and said, right. And he said, so you can't love yourself unless a man loves you. And she said, right. And the therapist said, okay, so here's what I want you to do. You got to get a career. You got to become a successful career woman. You got to get the rest of your education, get a marketable skill, then you can get a career, then you'll be self-sufficient, then you will feel good about yourself because you will be a successful career woman. She looks at her therapist and she says, look, with all due respect, you have helped me so much and I appreciate everything you've done, but let me ask you, you want me to take a typical female idol, which I have built my life upon, and it has destroyed my life. And now you want me to adopt a typical male idol. So instead of getting all my self-esteem from a man loving me, I'm going to get all my self-esteem from being successful and making money. And she looked at her therapist and she said, but what if I don't want either addiction? Can't you let me build my life on something that won't let me down? Can't I build my life on something that doesn't depend on me performing, on earning my salvation? And the therapist said, well, I don't know. But she did know. She knew that Jesus had died for her. She knew that Jesus loved her, that Jesus poured himself out for her. Every other man in her life came and said, it's your life for my life. But Jesus came to her and he said, it is my life for you. And so Jesus became her treasure. He was the only thing that was actually strong enough to be her foundation. There's nothing wrong with wanting a good job or a great marriage. There's nothing wrong with getting excited about sports or politics or hobbies, vacations, or even great musicians. But if you are tired of the relentless pursuit of this world, if you are exhausted by the rat race, by constantly chasing after the false promises of little idols that the world has to offer and the crushing disappointment when you discover that this thing is not enough to satisfy you either, then I want to invite you to turn to the one thing your soul actually needs. Turn all of your worship to God, and he will fulfill you like nothing else in this world can. Nothing can withstand all your worship except for God. Nothing can withstand the weight of who you are with all your hopes and your dreams, your deepest desires, and the core of your identity and the resonance of your soul, except for God. We all pick different idols, different things that we try to fit into that God-shaped hole in our hearts. But idols will always break your heart. So dedicate yourself, dedicate your heart, your whole heart, and all your keys, everything you've got, to the only one who can handle it. You can't be kind of pregnant. You can't be mostly dead. You can't be a parachute if you don't open. And you can't be a Christian without throwing away all your idols and giving all your worship to God. Let's pray.